Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Duckman TV episode. Today, I have the voice of rugby, Gordon Bray. It's an absolute delight and pleasure to have one of my idols. And I watched as a child growing up through the 70s, very late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And well, thank you very much for your time today, Gordon. Welcome to Duckman TV, Weekend Warriors.
Good to be with you, Matt, the Duckman. And lots of fond memories over those eras that you spoke of, and we can probably touch on a few today.
Absolutely, yeah, appreciate that. So, would you be able to give everybody a little bit of a rundown on your experience in getting into rugby, how that came about, and sort of what laid out the formative years in you getting into rugby union?
Well, I was just an average kid, actually born in the eastern suburbs, but my father was a cinema proprietor, and he was managing the theatre at Concord West, which was great for a young kid because when you had a birthday party, we always had a theatre party. I could invite the whole class, which meant I got sometimes 45 presents. But we moved out to the western suburbs and we lived in Burwood. And across the road, my best mate growing up, who's now a prominent lawyer in Sydney, his family had a big sheep paddock. So that's where we used to play a lot of our sport. We'd play cricket down there. That was interesting, but more interesting was rugby because you had to dodge the sheep droppings a lot of the time, and you'd come home with stains on your clothes, which didn't impress my mother. But we'd watch the ABC Match of the Day on television, and I'm talking about back in the early 60s and even the late 50s when rugby on television first started. But we'd watch the match of the day, then we'd go out into the paddock, the sheep paddock, with a ball, and we'd have a few other neighbourhood kids, and I'd usually do the commentary, reenacting what had happened in the match of the day, and quite often it was Randwick playing, and they were full of wallabies, and my hero was the scrum half for Randwick, who became Australian captain and became a legendary player, a Hall of Fame player, Ken Catchpole. So I was Ken Catchpole, he was a scrum half, and I always wanted to be a scrum half, and that's the way it panned out. So yeah, at primary school, played a bit of rugby league at primary school, and also the West's Junior Rugby Union. Went on my first rugby tour when I was 8 years of age to South Australia. When I got to high school at Homebush High, it was rugby all the way. Played a little bit of league, played a little bit of Jersey flag. My club team was Concord United. So played a little bit of Jersey flag, had a few games for Western Suburbs, but it was always going to be rugby union, and spent 3 years in the first 15, the last as captain, a couple of years with combined high schools, then went to Eastern Suburbs and had a year and a half in lower grades before I saw the cadetship with the ABC. And that was pretty well the end of my serious rugby career. You have it in a nutshell.
That's a good story to tell. So when you're around Concord and Burwood playing, so did you have much experience with Brey's at all? So Brey's Rugby Club or Brey's Sports Club in general?
Well, that was my first rugby club. My father took me down to the Brey's Club, and it was the under eights, I believe. And that was my introduction to rugby union. I had an instant affection. A lot of my mates were playing down there, and that led to getting a run with the West's junior team, which went over to South Australia. And I thought that was absolutely right up there at the summit of the mountain. So Brey's Rugby Club, who celebrated their centenary just a couple of years ago, was my first rugby team.
Oh, that's very good. So I have a bit of an affiliation with them, and I commentate a lot of the third division games. So I try to do the best I can to promote the games, and they're a very forthcoming club. They're open and community based, and it's very, very good. We've got many arms to Brey's Club through hockey and netball as well. So
many sports.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Terrific facilities and a wonderful bunch of people. Wayne Erickson, I think, also the test referee, who's now very prominent in rugby administration on the referee side. I think he was another ex-Breyers man as well. Probably more cricket. I think I might have even played a few games of cricket for Breyers, and certainly against them in those early days before I hit my teens.
Very nice oval. And they've done up the clubhouse at the moment. They've got a delightful scoreboard there when you're playing a game of rugby, and probably good in the game of cricket too if you're out in the middle batting away. So he's looking up at the people in the grandstand. So
That's a great setting.
it is impressive. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was the history of the game, and you eloquated that you can do this, and you know some information will be of great help to me in promoting the game. So I want to go back to the fundamentals of how the story of how it all began with William Webb Ellis back at the Rugby School of Warwickshire, 1823. Like, effectively picked up the ball in a game of football or soccer, as like it's known commonly in Australia, and ran it straight and ran it with vigor and conviction, and it was not frowned upon, but he's definitely started the movement of rugby union. So what can you shed light on that situation? What do you know about that and other help us with?
Well, I probably know as much as you and most others, but it's a very romantic tale. Some suggest it's extremely mythical, but as you say, Webb Ellis was playing in a massed football game at rugby school in 1823 when he had that inspired moment to pick up the ball and run with it. And that apparently was the defining moment of when rugby started. I like to believe in fairy tales and romance, so I'll go along with it. He actually was buried in France, and it's quite a tourist attraction now, his grave in France. So he is acknowledged as the man who started rugby union. But clearly it was a game that was played in the private schools, that the leading schools in England, really, probably you look at 7 or 8, and those schools, middle-class schools where the parents mainly came from landed gentry, wanted the best education for their sons, so they were sent to these private schools, and rugby school was one of those. And it became very much part of the moral compass, I suppose, of education of young men in that particular era. And we're talking about, the middle to the second half of the 19th century. So rugby was played in the private schools. It then spread to the north of England, which was very much the working class. And that created all sorts of problems when we got towards the end of the 19th century, because a lot of under the table payments were made to those working class players. And this was really frowned upon by the Rugby Football Union, based in obviously at Twickenham, and the East India Club in London. So they said, no, rugby must remain amateur. And eventually 3 clubs were expelled by the RFU, 3 northern clubs, and the working class played against the middle class teams, but there was quite a fierce rivalry there, and it became quite tribal. And then in about 1792, I think was the year, the northern rugby clubs, 22 of them, broke away from the RFU, the Rugby Football Union, and formed their own union where players could be played. And that was the start of rugby league. It spread to Australia around about 1908, and rugby league broke away. And I've done a little bit of research on this, and really in the First World War, most of the rugby players in New South Wales went away to the First World War. Everyone in the Sydney competition, I would say about 80% of the young men signed up. But the Irish Catholics were against conscription and what it stood for, and they remained behind, and they kept going with rugby league. And that's where rugby league really flourished during the First World War. There was no rugby union played at all because all the players were overseas. And Herb Moran, who was the first Wallaby skipper in 1908, and he was a surgeon on a hospital ship, I think in the Aegean Sea during First World War in 1915, sent a telegram over to all the rugby league players saying that you should be over here. We are now fighting the biggest game of all. And if you don't come and join us, we could be on the receiving end for a long time. So there was a little bit of rivalry, animosity even between rugby union and rugby league. And it all came down to working class and middle class. Not so much in Australia though, because when rugby league players broke away in 1908, the rugby union players came from all walks of life. And you had people from middle class mixing with the working class and doing it very happily. So it all came down to payment, and it took until 1995 for rugby to finally go professional. You could say screaming, screaming and kicking, but they got there.
I had the pleasure of interviewing David Moffat earlier in the year, and he told me a lot about how he was really right in the mix at the time. He was the CEO of New South Wales Rugby, and he helped set up Sanzar and brokered a $555 million TV rights deal with Fox Sports and everything for broadcast the rugby union. And that changed the landscape of rugby forever. All of a sudden, it went from being amateur to being professional. People could make a genuine living out of it. That lifted the standard of players because they didn't have to work full time anymore. They could be dedicated to rugby and just change everything. And that really seemed to have been fundamental, and it flowed on the other sports end. So we saw that outcome of league and rugby league and stuff like that. And around the same time, I had the ITV TV deal with the English Premier League and soccer. It went from English League One to the Premier League, and all sport became more professional, or really it went up a whole bunch of different levels across the world.
He's a very capable administrator in both rugby and rugby league, and he worked across the ditch as well, as you've mentioned.
Yep.
But I had a bit to do with David Moffat. I went to interview him one day. He was living in a suburb called Gordon on the North Shore, and it was a beautiful street, just lovely homes, and he had a 2-story place. And I said, "You couldn't point me to the worst house in the street, could you?" And he said, "Well, look, there's a place 2 doors down. They're a very elderly couple. It was just a modest Californian bungalow, but on half an acre." And he said, "Why don't you just knock on the door and see what happens?" And I said, "Oh, I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that." We were living 2 suburbs closer into the city at Linfield. Anyway, I drove past and said, "No, bugger it, I'm going to knock on the door." So I knocked on the door, and this little old guy came to the door, and he said, "Yes, can I help you?" And I said, "Oh, how do you do?" And he said, before I could continue, he said, "You're not Tim Bray's son, are you?" And I said, "Oh my God." I said, "I am." And my father had died probably 40 years earlier, but we have very strong genes on the male side of the Brey family.
Yes.
And so I have a close resemblance to my father, and he picked it up. And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I was best mates with your father during the war, and he actually saved my bacon. When I went AWOL, he got me back into camp." So bang, that's where we ended up purchasing that house several years later. It was a talk about fate playing its hand, but an incredible coincidence. And we finished up raising our children there in Gordon on that beautiful block of land.
That's a very impressive story, particularly being able to pick up and re-engage with like one of your dad's best friends or your dad's best mate so many years later in life. It's
right.
Stories like that, they're almost tear-jerking. They just make you feel good about everything about society and about people. There's not enough of that anymore.
It's eerie almost, and you think, well, that's almost divine intervention, isn't it? Yeah. I just couldn't work it out. But I went home to my wife and I said, "Look, we're going to buy that place. I don't know how we're going to do it, and I don't know how we're going to manage it, but I know it's going to happen." And eventually it did happen against a few obstacles, but it was certainly a game-changing moment for the family.
So was David Moffat able to help give you a slice of a $555 million TV rights deal to buy that house at all? So.
Yeah. No, well, he was the man who inspired me to go and knock on the door.
Yeah.
So I owe him big time. But also, he was a very good first grade referee, and I recall we were doing a Trans-Tasman Championship, under-17 Trans-Tasman Championship. So we had Auckland under-17, I think Wellington under-17, New South Wales, Queensland, ACT. So it was a really interesting competition at Victoria Barracks, and I was a touch judge. Assistant referee, as they're called now, and David Moffat was referee, and he was doing a match between Auckland and New South Wales under 17, and he was upsetting the Auckland boys because he kept penalising them for going off their feet. And I think they had a reasonable case. I think he was being a little overly harsh on them. Anyway, he got caught in a ruck, and the Auckland forward saw the opportunity to absolutely pile on top of him, and he disappeared from sight. I couldn't believe it. You talk about strange things happening on a referee field, on a rugby field. David Moffat disappeared under this bevy of Auckland under-17 bodies and twisted his knee totally and had to be carried off on a stretcher, which meant that I had to go out and referee and finish off the game. And I think Auckland actually won. So that proves that I'm a very partisan, objective referee. But also playing in that tournament for the Queensland under-17 team, and I got to referee them as well. One Daniel Herbert, World Cup winner, and also Pat Howard, another famous Wallaby. So yeah, that was really good fun. But poor old David Moffat, the worse for wear. He finished up in hospital, and I finished up, having a beer with the players, celebrating.
So where was Daniel Herbert playing number 12 that day, and Pat Howard playing in at 10, or was he playing fullback or on the wing?
Pat was number 10 and Dan Herbert was number 12, and you could see their quality then. I mean, Herbert was just a stout, robust, hard-running centre, and he just broke the line. And he and Pat Howard really stood out for that Queensland team.
That's outstanding. So, okay, we'll get back to some of the questions. That's a good story. I like those sorts of stories.
Got off track a bit there.
Yeah, we did. So, who were some of the notable stars that were coming through in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? Like, if phrase Ken Catchpole is your favourite player. So were you one of those kids like me? I used to play footy, and you run and you go, Austin puts the step on, he's tipped over the top, he's regathered, oh, it's a try. Did you do that sort of stuff during the games, or?
Yeah, no, I definitely did. Not so much during the games. I would listen intently. So, so when you say the 50s, I probably only started following in the late 50s, and that's when the games were televised for the first time, the rugby on ABC TV. But following a lot of those players, the Randwick side clearly were a brilliant team, and they played running rugby, the famous Galloping Greens. They had some terrific battles with the likes of Sydney University, who also had a lot of Wallabies. But they were such fun times. Norman May was the commentator. Cyril Towers was the expert in those days. And he was always complaining at the start of the telecast to Norman that these footballs are overinflated, Norman. It's just not a reliable bounce. And without doubt, without fail, every telecast, Cyril would complain about the overinflated footballs. But that was it was magical stuff. And then, as I say, you'd go off, you'd have your heroes, and you'd replay those games in the sporting fields, in the local parks with your mates and the neighbourhood kids, and that was where it all started.
Those were the days. I love those sorts of days. I've got stories of them too I can bring up from the 80s and the 90s, growing up as a child, then as a teenager, and then you get a little bit too old and a little bit too cool for that anymore, and you meet girls and what's football and all that sort of stuff. So I
was too interested in sport, I think, to worry about girls at that stage. But, it does change. It does change, yes.
It definitely does.
Probably up till about 16, I was very focused on my two sports were cricket and rugby, and it was almost 24/7.
Yeah,
7 days.
I was like that with cricket, soccer, and rugby until I got to about 20, and then that just started to get work in that as well, and work really quite a hindrance into my professional / football career, which never really took off or went anywhere any great magnitude. So, how did you meet?
You had fun.
I did have fun.
You had fun. You played with your mates, and it gave you a set of standards, how to conduct yourself on the playing field, and how to conduct yourself in life. That's what rugby offers, and so in that sense, it doesn't matter what level you play at. It's your way of having your rugby fix, your playing fix, and doing it with your mates, and then being able to socialise. That's the beauty of the game.
find rugby is very different because I've played many different sports. I went to a public school. I went to Cambridge Park, which is near Penrith, and I had that exposure at school. I managed to play softball, baseball, hockey. I played soccer for years. I played rugby, played rugby league. I think I tried my hand at nearly every sport I had on offer. And that's one thing you get to do in Australia that you might not really get to try elsewhere. Because when you speak to people from other countries, they say in England, you're either a rugby league person or you're a rugby person. Or if you're a football person, that's what you do. You don't really bounce around between, oh, this year I'm going to do this, or on Saturdays I'm going to play soccer with my mates, I'm going to play rugby another day, you're going to play touch football some other day. It's not really like that, is it?
No, no. I think it doesn't. What you're saying is, although you didn't go to a private school, you went to a public school, a state school, as I did, and the opportunities are still there. In the school holidays, you can attend sporting camps. Department of Sport and Recreation. There are always those opportunities. So that was always there, and you could go to any sporting club in your area, whether it be soccer or rugby league or hockey, whatever, cricket, and you could be involved. So as you say, we have that freedom of choice in Australia, and we have the beautiful weather conditions. Even in winter, you get days where it's like the middle of summer. So we're very lucky in that regard, and we have a lot of open space, a lot of parks and playing fields and sporting facilities, and a lot of support now from the government, state government and the federal government, to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to be involved. There's a real focus on sporting activity because that's healthy. It's
right.
healthy for your development as kids, and also your education and respect of teammates and opposition players. That's all part of the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Often character building and helps make people who they are, who they become. So it teaches you to win and lose and be respectful and be able to take instruction and deliver that, and help shape who the people are now. So grandchildren, I've got a grandson who plays under sixes rugby league now, and he loves it, and they get the most enjoyment to watch him play. So it's amazing.
I've only
So,
got one grandchild.
yeah,
She is 17 months. So she's over in London.
yeah.
She's going to be sporty, I can tell you. My daughter's over there, and they're based in London. And little Eva Rose is on the go. She is on the go. We're convinced she's going to be sporty because she just takes off, and she doesn't stop. And she's not very sociable. She just entertains herself. And in fact, Mum has been the only time Mum gets any affection is when Eva Rose is sick. And she's
Okay.
not 100%. That's when she needs a bit of affection. Otherwise, she's off and doing her own thing.
Yeah.
So that's going to be haven't been with her yet. We're hoping to get over there at some stage before the end of the year, which I'll really be looking forward to. But that's one of the frustrations of this pandemic.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, how did your media career as a sports broadcaster take shape? And I know that you previously said that Norman Nugget May was one of your idols as a person coming through to media, particularly as a young man. He would have been about 40 when he started working with you, I imagine, and is well versed. So what was that like?
Yeah, well, to answer the first part of your question, I applied for a cadetship with ABC Sport, and at the time, I'd really only been out of school for just over a year, still a teenager, and I was working for the late Bob Oatley, the man who started Rosemount Wines and then owned Hamilton Island and Wild Oats 11, the famous Super Maxi. So he was a very successful businessman, and he was importing coffee and cocoa beans from Papua New Guinea. And he employed me out of school, and he was going to send me up there to manage one of his coffee stores. So there would have been no rugby calling up there, that's for sure. But I saw the ad in the paper, applied for it and got it. Drew Moffat, the late Drew Moffat, wonderful commentator, took me through my audition, which was quite rigorous. And we managed to get through, and 2 years training in Sydney. Some of the other trainees were interesting. Bob Carr was a current affairs trainee, yes. the guy who started Triple J, Marius Webb, was another trainee in music or drama. Alan Humphreys, do you remember Alan Humphreys, the weatherman on the ABC? He was a trainee. So yeah, it was a very interesting, eclectic group of people. And pardon me, before me, there were people like Drew Moffat, Peter Mears, who went up to Brisbane, very, very good commentators. After me, Jimmy Maxwell, the voice of cricket. He started just a few years after I did, and we were actually mates even before he joined the ABC. We were actually playing a bit of sport together through other contacts. So it was a real production line of specialist trainees that came to the fore. And then the idea was you got transferred to a so-called BAF state, which be Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth or Hobart. Drew Morfitt went to Perth. Peter Mears went to Hobart initially and then up to Brisbane. And I got promoted to Hobart. And I had 4 years down there calling anything and everything that moved.
Yep.
Fantastic experience. I stumbled many times. I nearly drowned many times, figuratively speaking, but just had terrific experience. And that really set me up for further opportunities when I came back to Sydney. And I met Norman May the first day I arrived in the office as a cadet in 164 William Street. And he said, how are you, Gordo? When are we going to the pub? And I said, well, Mr. May, I don't think I should be going today, my first day. And there's the famous story where I met him the following Saturday night. He insisted I give him my pay packet, all $29. And he said, we'll put it through the pokies and we'll double it for you. And yeah, it was lost in the twinkling of an eye. So I was penniless then for the next week, but a great character. Norman, a lot of the early time there when I was training, you would go out to sporting events and you'd probably be a scorer or a statistician for Norman when he was calling the rugby or calling Sheffield Shield cricket or Test cricket. The ABC used to do the last session of the Sheffield Shield match, each day's play from 4 o'clock. And so I'd be out there. We'd be out there for the whole day at the SCG, and the telecast would start at about 10 to 4, and Norman would take it through. And I would be like a scorer. You didn't get the opportunity to commentate at that point. They didn't think you were ready, but you'd roll up at a shoot shield game. I remember one day at Manly Oval at 5 minutes to 3, I was sitting up in the scaffold, the ABC scaffold, Manly and Norths actually, and I was ready to do the scoring. And the director came through. I had the headphones on. I like to put the headphones on and pretend I was going to be the commentator. And the director said, Nugget hasn't turned up, Gordon. You may have to call this. And I said, what? Okay, I'm ready to go. I can do it. Yeah. And anyway, so the adrenaline really got pumping. And then at 1 minute to 3, Norman May screeched. I heard the tyres screech outside that brick wall at the northern end of Manly Oval. And I looked over the scaffold and sure enough, it was Norman and Ken Catchpole, who was the expert commentator that day. And they scrambled up the ladder to the top of the scaffold. Norman jumped in the seat. He said, hello, Gordo, who's playing? and I just looked at him. I said, oh, Mr. May, gave him the headphones. And he said, May here, standing by. And Ken Catchpole put his headphones on and bang, away they went. Cue Norman. Well, it's a lovely day here at Manly Oval, and we've just witnessed a remarkable reserve grade fixture. And he's looking at the scoreboard, and Manly has won by 18 points to 15. And I thought, how can he say that? He wasn't even there. Yeah. But anyway, he went on and did the commentary, and it was a flawless commentary, I've got to say. I was just awestruck to think that he could do it. Afterwards, I said, Mr. May, how could you possibly say that reserve grade game was such an extraordinary fixture? He said, no problem, no problem. We were watching from the RSL club across the road. So he'd actually watched the reserve grade having a drink through the window. And that was Norman May. He was a remarkable character, and he was the benchmark for broadcasters in Australia. He called everything. He was Mr. Olympics. I'd liken him to a Bruce McAvaney today. Yep. Very versatile, outstanding mind, just a steel trap brilliant retention of sporting facts and figures. Gave the impression he didn't do any homework, but he did. And he had a photographic memory. But he had a real sense of entertainment and drama and theatre when it was needed. And he was just a fantastic mentor, someone who you could observe and see how he worked
Yes.
and see how he performed. And it was always at a very high level.
So you yourself have been involved in 9 Olympic Games and 5 Commonwealth Games. So what's your biggest highlight out of all of those experiences you've had with the Commonwealth Games and Olympics?
Well, I got my first break. I was in Hobart in 1974, coming towards the end of my stint in Hobart, and the ABC decided they were going to send a young commentator from someone from around Australia. I thought maybe Drew Morford or Peter Mears would get the gig. They were more senior to me. I'd worked very hard in Hobart and made a good impression. There was another young guy there, Graham McNaney. So I thought, look, I'd be a chance. And this was really breaking with tradition because all of the senior ABC callers, people like Dick Mason, Norman May, Noel Bailey, Ken Dakin, these were all very senior sports commentators, very versatile, Arthur Denovan. And I thought, I'm a rough chance, but when they announced the team, there was a young man in there. It wasn't Drew, it wasn't Peter Mears, it was Graham McNaney, my colleague in Hobart. And he was a very talented commentator, but I was absolutely devastated that I'd missed out. And as events turned out, he invited me to his barbecue. And I've told this story many times. He was cooking my steak on the barbecue and a brick fell off the barbecue. Someone knocked it. It wasn't me. Fell straight onto his foot. And he was only wearing thongs. And it fell onto his brick toe on the edge. The edge of the brick fell full force onto his brick toe, onto his foot, onto his thumb, onto his toe, and broke his toe, his big toe. So he was ruled unfit to travel. And the call came through next day that, Gordon, you're going to Christchurch as part of the ABC team. I think I was the nearest person to Graham in terms of geography. And it was just a matter of changing the name on the airline ticket to get me to Sydney. So that was a massive break. And that got me onto the games team. I didn't do a lot over there. I saw one of the outstanding performances there was Filbert Bayi from Tanzania in the men's 1500 meters. John Walker, the great Kiwi 1500 meter runner, was probably the local favorite, most definitely. But Filbert Bayi decided to just shoot out in the lead, and he opened up a big break on the field, probably 40 meters, and kept going at this incredible pace. And in the end, he smashed the world record. I think the first 4 runners were under the world record for 1500 meters, and John Walker stormed home into second place, a gallant run. But that was quite incredible to see something like that. But that was my first experience of a games. Shared a motel room with Dick Mason, the great broadcaster from Melbourne, the late Dick Mason. He was an AFL caller. He did cricket. Basketball was one of his loves, and also baseball. In fact, he was a pee-wee baseball umpire, and he was a very large man. He was certainly overweight, and he had a Datsun 240Z, a sports car. And one of the funniest things I've ever seen was Dick Mason rolling up to the ABC studios in Melbourne after he'd umpired a baseball game, a pee-wee baseball game, and all his baseball gear, and trying to get out of this 240Z. He had to actually leverage himself out backwards and go on his back onto the ground to actually get out of the car. So he was a great character. I remember he wore the same pair of trousers for 3 weeks. He used to hang them up over the coat hanger, and they'd hang down. And that's all he had. He only just arrived with a little sort of airline bag, and they were the clothes. A few pairs of underpants and socks, and just basically one pair of trousers. And I couldn't get my head around that. But that's probably a little bit too much information. But He was a terrific commentator.
I can relate to being a big guy getting out of little caravans and very little cars back in the day, and had a Mitsubishi Lancer, and I had to ride, and at 6'5" and 150 odd kilos, it's not the easiest
It's not
to get in
easy.
and out.
I have trouble getting out of my car now. And yeah, it's you've got to be a little bit self-conscious, haven't you? When make sure no one's watching.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
So through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, come back to rugby. How do you think some of the rule changes have affected the game from them rolling forward into now? So
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if you go back to the 60s, when I really was taking a keen interest, you could kick the ball out on the full from anywhere on the field. So that led to a lot of negative rugby, and it didn't really encourage running rugby. I think the Fijians, when they came to Australia in the early 50s, certainly turned that all around with their brilliant running style, their love of ball in hand and support play and spreading it all over the field. And they probably saved Australian rugby with those tours in 52 and 1954. They packed out the Sydney Cricket Ground, and that saved the finances of Australian rugby. So that was an important one, where you could only kick it from inside your 22 when that was changed. I think the idea of quick lineouts, those rules that have come in that have sped up the game, where you can have a quick lineout, that's been very positive. Lifting in the lineout. I remember going to South Africa in 1992 with the Wallabies, and we noticed that there was a lot of lifting going on with these giant South African men. So you had no hope of actually trying to jump naturally to win a line out against them. So that was a development. And I think the administrators saw the benefits there, that not so much the lifting, but supporting the jumper at the top of the jump. You could do that. So that sort of crept in. And then finally, I think maybe it was about 14 years ago, lifting in the line out was allowed. So you get a lot of variation now, and a lot of ability to get a clean line out ball to the backs and get things moving. So moving the back line 5 meters back from the scrum. I'd like to see that 10 meters back from the scrum, actually. And I think there's so much opportunity from the set piece, particularly when you've got 8 forwards together in that conformation and only 7 backs out there. That's the opportunity to really develop some attacking ploys and take advantage of the space and the reduced numbers. And I think a lot of teams these days ignore that particular element of the game for the backs, where you do have extra space from a set piece. You've got that extra 5 meters with the defensive line. And, I think teams should be more focused on taking attacking opportunities from the scrum.
So how do you think a development like that, if it had have come in, let's say, the 80s, it would have helped like one of the great attacking sides? They say that the Grand Slam Wallaby side of 1984 is one of our greatest ever attacking sides. And that was really my first foray into following rugby. I was only young. I was only 6 or 7. My memory of that sketchy compared to what your memory would be. So stuff like that would really have helped Mark and Gabriella and all the players out Campese, all the players outside of them, Michael Lyon, Nick Jones, etc.
Yeah, well, they were 1984. I think that was the Grand Slam tour, as you say. I was over there calling those games. Actually, my wife, we'd only just been married, so that was our honeymoon. Can you think of a better way to spend your honeymoon? Best seat in the house at all of those great grounds. And that was a very interesting formation. We didn't see a lot of scrum collapses in those days. You put the ball in the scrum and you got on with it. Australia had a terrific scrum, a very strong front row, and people like Steve Williams and Steve Cutler in the second row, Steve Timon, the great Simon Poiterman, terrific pack of forwards and brilliant backs. You mentioned Mark Ella, Nick Farr-Jones, Michael Lynagh, David Campese, Roger Gould. Boy, they were magnificent players. And we saw a more direct approach from the Aussie backs in those days. I'm so pleased in the most recent French test, Lolesio was a lot more direct. He was attacking the defensive line. He was committing defenders, and that's the first time I've seen him really play that way at test level. And boy, what a difference it made. And that was a forte of that 84 Grand Slam team of Mark Ella, where you were actually in close contact with the defensive line and actually committing defenders rather than just transferring pressure to people further outside you. So, yeah, it was a very interesting formation. It started, I suppose, with Bob Dwyer in 1982, but also with the Ella brothers when they came in. Mark Ella came in 1980, and Michael Hawker when they played that series against New Zealand, and a lot of those Australian schoolboys, those backs in particular, came into the Wallaby team. That schoolboy team of 77, 78 that went through Britain undefeated. Wally Lewis couldn't get a run in the starting team. Tony Melrose was the captain. You had Mark Glennon, Gary Ella, Michael Hawker, Michael O'Connor. So, yeah, that style of play came from another Randwick man, Jeff Mould. That formation of standing close together, standing close to the defensive line, and running hard and straight with the ball, quick hands and support play, support running lines, very important. And so that was, you look back at that tape now of 1984, the highlights tape that the ABC put out. I often get it out and have a look, and a lot of those principles certainly still apply today.
Well, you see Mark Ella take the ball straight up at the line, which is unusual. And number 10 now will tend to get the ball and start to drift. So with the ball across the park and take away room from the outside backs. But Mark Ella, as a coach, because I coach as well, look at him actually attack the line and draw the 7 and the 8 into making a commitment to tackle and start numbers on the outside then and create room for the outside backs. They don't play like that now. Look,
no, you're right. I think New Zealand picked up a lot from us, from that style of play going back into the early 80s. And now you look at the New Zealand team and their running lines are very straight and direct. And they're all about creating space out wide. And they do it very successfully, particularly on the counter-attack.
Yeah. So, yeah, I saw, there's only one thing, I suppose, rugby now. I watched young Tate McDermott the other day in the third test. I picked the ball up a lot for a 9. I'd play with 9s, a box kick the ball. He looked to box kick an awful lot. So maybe it's the game is constantly changing, but yeah, I would like to see him run a bit more ball in hand. Got a lot of talent and potential, so create different chances by doing that.
He got some quick ball there, and he does like to run. That's his forte. But clearly a halfback in this modern game has to have that extra string of a good, reliable, accurate box kick. We'll see a lot of it in the Lions, British and Irish Lions, South Africa series, Faf de Klerk. He's pinpoint accurate. And it's part of the game now, unfortunately. But Tate McDermott does have really good pace off the mark and good acceleration. And I'd like to see him still be prepared to run a little bit more. And there were half gaps there that he could easily have taken in that last French test, where he actually then passed. So he is a guy who can worry a defense, but have a run if you get quick ball and commit the defenders. And if you're not going to take the gap yourself, put someone else through.
That's right. So in 1991 Rugby World Cup, that was pretty much a landmark event for you, and the Wallabies ultimately won the World Cup. So on the back of very strong performances, we beat Samoa in the group stages, I think. So, and then we rolled into the quarterfinal against Ireland, and it looked like we are going to drop that game. And we just come. What was your takeaway on that game?
Well, it was horrible when Gordon Hamilton scored the try. I can tell you, I looked at my fellow commentators, Chris Handy and Gary Pearce, and they were as white as ghosts. You think there'd been a death in the family. We looked at each other and said, "Oh my goodness, we could be going home." Well, we wouldn't be going home, but the Wallabies could be going home. And that's where we didn't say anything for 31 seconds. I timed it, but deliberately didn't say anything because the jubilation, the euphoria of the Irish fans who ran out on the field was just palpable. It would have been criminal to say anything at that point. But probably the most dramatic game I've called involving the Wallabies. And when they won that game, we were in the pubs afterwards with Buddha and Gary Pearce, and the Irish fans were pretty devastated. But after an hour, an Irish fan came up and said, "Hi, I'm Paddy. And I've got to say, Ireland's now the second best team in the world because we've just lost to the best." And I was very confident we'd go on and win the final after that performance. It had been a terrific campaign all the way through. Big win over Wales, a torrid match against Samoa, beating Argentina in the first game. So everything was on target. There was huge support back in Australia through the ABC live telecasts. And the rest is history. That performance in the first half against New Zealand at the same ground, Lansdowne Road, was a near perfect performance by the Wallabies. And David Campese stole the show with the first try, and then that miracle pass to Tim Horan. And then the final was, as it turned out, England changed their game plan and really ran the ball at us and stretched Australia totally, but somehow we held on. We survived. It was a survival exercise. And great work by Timmy Horan and Simon Poitevin just before him to set up that Horan break. And then the throw, Bob Dwyer, I did an interview with him recently, and he said that is the only time in the whole World Cup where we called a throw to Willie Offahengawe. And it actually went to Willie. I was so surprised. I thought Bill Kearns has stuffed this up. It went to Willie Offahengawe, and Bob Dwyer said, we knew that if we threw the ball to Willie, there was no chance he would drop it because he had the biggest hands he'd ever seen. They were like dinner plates. And of course, Australia drove over the line for the only try of the game to Tony Daly. Ewan McKenzie and Tony Daly went over the line together. And in commentary, I said, give it to both of them. But Daly got the try. McKenzie certainly had grounded it as well. But it was a magnificent occasion for Australian rugby, surpassing even the Grand Slam to win the World Cup in 1991.
So that semi-final game, I was going through the highlights of that again the other night, watching that, and out of all the games, I haven't seen Campo play 101 tests. I've probably watched 40 or 50 of them. But that one game is the best game of rugby I've ever seen him play, in my opinion. So it might not be you've seen many more games. I'm sure you've seen him play better games from time to time, but his involvement, everything he did was at the highest level he could do every time. Pass, no look pass, drawing two players on the outside to Tim Horan away. That was a good try. Counter run across field. There's one of the best tries you're ever going to see. But it's good to see the two prop get in there in the final and score tries, not seagulling in the corner either.
Yeah. Well, I think Campo is probably the greatest entertainer I've called as a commentator. And that semi-final, as you say, the All Blacks were spooked by him. Certainly that try where he ran diagonally towards the corner post, they held off. They just didn't know what he was going to do. I don't think Campo knew what he was going to do either. That was the beauty of David Campese. His teammates didn't know what he was going to do, and half the time he didn't, let alone the poor old opposition. And Campo was one of those instinctive, unpredictable players, one in a million really. And he rightly was player of the tournament in 1991. He had a sensational tournament.
Yeah, well, had some sensational players then, and so good to have those players. How do you think that team would go in modern day rugby? Because it's changed a lot more now. It's completely professional, and the standard of opposition is probably down a little bit compared to what it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when every side seemed to be a bit stronger. But they're regenerating with youth throughout most of world rugby at the moment. So, which is the first time in a little while they've done that. What most of the nations seem to be doing it. So,
I don't think you can't compare eras, but you can compare quality. And I would say that 1991 Wallaby team, in terms of quality, holds up to any era. And it's probably backed up by the fact that I can count 6 players in that team who would make a World 15. And that's Bob Dwyer's famous line too. You need at least 5 players of your 15 who would hold their own in a World 15. And certainly that Australian team had 5 players, if not 6. And they were a quality side. They had many different aspects to their game. They could play a tight game. They could play an expansive game. They could find the balance when needed, and they knew how to win, as we saw against the Irish and then in the final against England. So, yeah, they hold up against the very best teams of any era.
You work with some outstanding commentators, as you mentioned before, Buddha Handy and Gary Pearce. What were those two guys like to work with? Buddha, he just seemed like he was the life of the party. Is that what he's like when you're working with the man?
Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed with Buddha. Probably a bit quieter these days. Gary Pearce was my first expert commentator, and that was in France in 1976. That was my first Wallaby tour, where I actually paid my own way over, and the ABC broadcast the internationals from Bordeaux and Paris on radio. Yeah. And that was a real experience. I was there by myself. Pretty well had no money as a young guy on an ABC wage, and I seconded Gary Pearce to join me in the commentary in the grandstand. We just sat in an open grandstand with all the spectators around us. The French technician spoke no English. I had no idea if we were getting through to Australia. He said, "No, I don't." You know, he'd put his hands up. Je ne comprends pas, monsieur. You know. Anyway, apparently we did get through, and I know we definitely got through because just before halftime, the famous story, Ken Wright, who was playing I think he was playing inside centre or outside centre, made a siding break and drew the French fullback, drew à court, and then passed to Laurie Monaghan, who scored under the posts. And Australia would have gone in at halftime with a nice lead. But the Scottish referee, Alan Hosey, ruled forward pass. And I kid you not, he was 20 metres behind the play. How he was in a position to call forward. And it wasn't a forward pass, I can tell you. I was in line. We were right on halfway. And anyway, Gary Pearce, my expert commentator, said that is absolute bullshit. And then realised what he'd said on ABC National Radio. And I thought, well, I wonder if we are going through to Australia. I guess we'll find out at some stage in the future. Anyway, sure enough, I got a call. We lost the game, by the way. The try was disallowed. We lost at 18-15. And so it was a game Australia rightly deserved to win. We got smashed in the second test in Paris. But I got a call on the Monday from the head of sport in my hotel room in Bordeaux, the late Bernard Kerr. "Hello, Gordon. Is that you?" I said, "Oh, yes, Mr. Kerr. Mr. Kerr, before you go anywhere, I know why you're ringing, and we've told that Australian spectator to keep well away from our microphone for the next broadcast." "Oh, wasn't that Gary Pearce?" "No, Mr. Kerr. No, it was a bloody Australian spectator right on our microphone." And I was very, very angry, but we'll make sure he's nowhere near the microphone next time. Anyway, I saved Gary Pearce's bacon and convinced the head of sport that it wasn't him. And he then went on to a very successful commentating career. He was a very good Wallaby apart from that, but a great guy, and we're still friends.
That's fair. I like that story. So, you mentioned just before as well.
I didn't tell you about Buddha. You didn't ask me to follow up on Buddha.
Yeah, no, you haven't followed up on Buddha yet. So I've seen him I saw him dress up once as a woman. I can't remember what that was for. I can't remember what that was for. On one of the rugby shows.
Yeah, he had his wrestling suit that he always wore underneath his television garb. Yeah. And he loved getting down to his wrestling suit when the night was long and in the early hours. He used to go, when Australia had a big win in New Zealand, he had a ritual of going for a skinny dip in Auckland Harbour or Wellington Harbour or in the Avon River in Christchurch. And a couple of the players normally did too, Nick Farr-Jones and Tim Horan. He was a wonderful character, wore his heart on his sleeve, and he was very emotive in his calling. He really gave us a feel for what it was like to pack into a scrum. I don't want to know about anything to do with packing in a scrum, but Buddha had that very colourful vocabulary and way of describing how every sinew in your backside was working overtime, and your eyeballs were popping out and your eardrums were bursting when you back down against a particular player. But there was one funny story with him. I used to try and avoid him as much as possible on tour, because he was normally taking a tour group. He was a tour leader, and they used to lead him up the garden path all the time and get him into trouble. And quite often he'd come to a test match with only a few hours sleep under his belt, but always performed at a magnificent level. But I remember Channel 7 decided we weren't going to stay in a hotel in Melbourne. We're going to stay in serviced apartments. And they said, Gordon, you're sharing with Buddha. And I said, oh no, this is going to be very dangerous, very dangerous. Anyway, after the test match, Buddha said, when I get back, we'll have a drink. And I stayed up till about midnight. I'd had a few drinks after the game, stayed up till midnight. I thought he's not going to come in till about 3 o'clock. And so I locked my bedroom door. I locked it because I was catching a flight at 7 a.m. back to Sydney. And sure enough, knocking on the door, thumping on the door, come out, you little bastard. And I'm looking at my clock. My God, it's 3:15. I know you're awake. Come on, you can hear me. And he's banging, and I refused to come out. Anyway, I got back to sleep, and then I snuck out at about, the alarm went, and I snuck out at 5:30, and I came out, and the lights were still on, the TV was still on, and there was Buddha in his underpants and nothing else, his feet up on the table. He had a bowl of sultana bran, a fork in the other hand. His head was back and he was snoring. And on the TV were the cartoons. And I thought, I think today where you have a mobile phone, if only I could have got that shot. It was the most candid shot you'll ever get of Chris Handy in his underpants with his sultana bran, his fork, and snoring and watching the cartoons. And I snuck out the door and closed the latch very softly and escaped back to Tullamarine Airport. But it could have been very nasty, I must say. It could have been ugly. As it turned out, I had my sultana bran out at the airport.
It's hard to imagine that from a Wallabies enforcer when he played prop. How many tests did he play for the Wallabies?
Look, he played probably 6 or 7. I think he played maybe 6 or 7 tests, but he had 3 wins over the All Blacks.
Yeah.
3 test matches. So his percentage against the All Blacks is through the roof.
Yeah.
In 1979, then in 1980, and also in 1978, the famous test where Greg Cornelsen scored 4 tries at Eden Park. And that's where Buddha was told he had to punch Andy Hayden in the first line out. And I think Buddha broke his hand. I'm not sure, but anyway, Andy Hayden said, you'll have to do better than that, son.
Yeah.
But anyway, that was a famous victory for Australia. 30 points to 16. Greg Cornelsen, 4 tries, and Buddha was in the front row.
He's a very robust prop, and he's an affable person. Like the crowd and the fans on TV can relate to him.
An ambassador for Bundaberg rum.
Yeah.
So he used to carry a little suitcase around of those mini Bundaberg rum bottles, and we always had a rum and coke. We always had a Bundy and coke before any telecast. And you asked me about funny moments. The funniest moment, I think, was the day when the steward at Ballymore tripped over my headset cord, and he had a whole jug of Bundaberg rum and coke, which Buddha had ordered because we'd forgotten to have our little ritual before the game. And this was halfway through the first half, and he tipped, after tripping over my cord, he tipped half of the contents of the jug down the back of my neck while I was commentating Australia versus Wales. Mm-hmm. And from memory, Jason Little scored the try, but I kept going, got the try out, but I couldn't get any comments out of Buddha and Gary Pearce because they were just cacking themselves in fits of laughter. And there was just rum and coke all over the equipment, all over my back of my neck and my coat, and it had splashed onto the 2 expert commentators as well. So yeah, never a dull moment with Chris Handy in the commentary box and outside the commentary box as well.
Yeah. You've done many a tour around many places all over the world as well. Where are some of the great places to go, great pubs to have a drink, and great place to have feed throughout the world that you've been, you'd like to really promote or drum up?
Well, I had that tour of France. My first tour was I was part of the touring team, really. The ARU made me an officially accredited member of the touring team. So I dined with the players and drank with the players. I went to the team meetings. I actually trained with the team as a young kid. I was about 25 then on that first tour. So we went to lots of fun places there, a very special experience. It would never happen today. I think Ireland's probably my favorite country to tour. When we beat Ireland in that game in the quarterfinal in 1991, we went to a Japanese restaurant, and Tim Gavin was there and a few other mates, and we were actually dancing on the tables, singing Waltzing Matilda. And then we went over to the old Belvedere Rugby Club across the road. We were politely asked to leave the Japanese restaurant in Donnybrook, and we went over to the old Belvedere Rugby Club, and one of the people in our party was the late, great Paul Ramsey of Ramsey Healthcare fame. And Paul was a huge Wallaby supporter, very gregarious soul, loved his rugby, and we were having a wonderful time celebrating the win. And we went to the old Belvedere Rugby Club, and Paul went up to the little barman and slapped down what I reckon was about $500 US dollars on the table and said, "How do you do? I'm with my colleagues from Australia. My name's Paul Ramsey, and I want to shout the bar." And the whole place was absolutely teeming. And the little Irish barman looked up and looked at the $500 US dollars and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, we only accept Irish punts." And we couldn't get a drink. We couldn't get a drink there. He wouldn't accept US dollars. Can you believe it? So anyway, once the locals heard that we were going to shout the bar, we didn't have to buy a drink all night. And we were accepted as honorary Irishmen, I think, on that occasion. So yeah, Ireland's a very favourite place for me to tour. If I look at other spots around the world, the Hong Kong Sevens, probably covered the Sevens for more than a decade. And that's one big party. And having the opportunity of drinking kava with the Fijians at the Hilton Hotel in their hotel room after they won the Hong Kong Sevens final against New Zealand with Nick Farr-Jones. God, I was sick that night. Kava just does not agree with me. And I don't remember what happened. I don't even remember getting back to my room. But apparently Nick says we went out to a bar and then came back in the early hours of the morning. It's all a blank to me. But lots of fun times. And it's all about that socializing, and having the opportunity to socialize with the players is really very special. And that's been an opportunity afforded to me over a long period.
Yeah, that's what I think. One thing rugby really offers that some of the other sports don't. Like soccer's got to that professional level now. Like players get weighed at home or wherever before games, after games, and all this stuff. And I'm not sure rugby does that. They're still I've had players at the end of field games. "Oh, you want a beer?" They're already walking down with two, and I said, "You want one?" "Well, I'll have a beer." Now, knock back a couple of beers with people in the crowd, then they wander off and do their after-match function and whatever else comes with the proceedings.
That's the joy. It's the joy of grassroots rugby, and it's very sociable. People are generous. They're friendly. We all have a common connection, and if it's the home team, it's about being hospitable and entering into the spirit of what it's all about.
I'm going to run a couple more questions by, and I thank you for your time this afternoon. It's been absolutely delightful chatting with you this afternoon. So women's rugby has really exploded since the 2016 Olympics, and on the back of the gold medal winning Sevens women's rugby. The good thing is most of those girls are still playing some level, either Jack Scott Cup or Super Rugby in their appropriate states, or Sevens rugby. So how do you think we can take rugby to go forward from a women's rugby purpose to really help benefit the Wallaroos down the track?
Well, I think with women's rugby, the Rio gold medal was a wonderful catalyst. And it's incredible how those sporting heroes then are a catalyst for the next generation of youngsters, of young girls coming through. I mean, you see Ash Barty now, and all the young girls who are wanting to play tennis now and become an Ash Barty. So in our young days, Matt, we had our heroes, and we looked up to these people because they were probably conquering the world, or certainly performing at a very high level. And I think the Rio Olympic team winning that gold medal has really created an explosion of interest in sevens rugby and also women's rugby. So it's important now to maintain that momentum. And the Australian women's team are right up there in the top three in the world. And it comes down to programs in the schools. And the schools are very important. And I think you'll find that being an Olympic sport now, sevens rugby for women is extremely popular. I'm involved with Hunters Hill Rugby Club, who I'm sure you've commentated.
Yep.
And they have a squad of 30 females, and they play sevens. And that's a subbies club. So all of the Shoot Shield clubs have women's teams, and the Wallaroos are now being, very well backed and supported by Bill Corp. Tony and Josephine Suka have done a terrific job there in really fostering and elevating women's rugby to the level it deserves. And as a result, Australia is now very competitive and will be looking forward to competing in the World Cup. But the crux of your question is, it's got to be maintained. We've got to have those programs, the development officers and the teachers, and even the equipment, so that young girls can be involved at school level. And the Olympic funding that comes with being an Olympic sport, the main thing is that that's being injected in the right way.
So the best ever Wallaby players that you've seen, mentioned them before, Mark Ella and David Kemp, he did it. Got all the flair and panache and everything that you look for. Would they be your favourite players, Wallabies, or best ever players you've seen?
Yeah, I could go from my first commentating start in the mid 70s of test matches. I would say my favourite players, I can run through them. I love Ken Wright when he was playing for Australia. The Zip man, he went to rugby league. Before that, my heroes, obviously Ken Catchpole, the late John Thornett, the Wallaby captain who led that beautiful tour through South Africa in 1963. Rob Hemming, a second rower from Manly. He was only about 6'2". Now, what's that? I've got in metrics. I've got to be careful there.
188 centimetres, something like that. I'm 195. I'm 6'5".
Okay, well, you'll appreciate this, Matt. Rob Hemming was jumping against Springboks who were twice his size and competing against Springboks who were literally twice his size in South Africa in 1963. He had a wonderful series. Australia drew the series, unlucky not to win the series, and they were feted and hailed as real heroes in South Africa, and also by the rugby world. Rob Hemming, at 6'2", maybe just barely 6'2", could clap his hands above the crossbar from a standing jump, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And so he was a bit of a hero of mine in those early days as well. And then we came through to the late 70s and the 80s, Mark Ella, Campo, Simon Poiterman, Timmy Horan, John Eales, to me was an absolute freak. He became a great leader. A very underrated player for me, not only as a player, but as a captain, was Andy Slack, a terrific guy, very much a team man. And Nick Farr-Jones, boy, oh boy, Nick Farr-Jones, one of our greatest Wallaby captains. Who else haven't I mentioned? Tim Gavin, I thought was a brilliant number 8, and Willie Offahengawe. I love Willie. Incredible talent. You did not upset him. The Irish did in that quarter final in the 91 World Cup, and they came off second best. I've never seen such a fistic fury from Willie O. In this day and age, a couple of players would have been sent off. And I think, and coming through to the current crop of players, I did enjoy Kurtley Beale. I was a big fan of Quade Cooper. He was the guy who had to be treated correctly, and I don't think Australian rugby really looked after him as well as they could have. But he was certainly a pretty freaky talent, and I do hope that he is accepted, by the way, as an Australian citizen. He's apparently applied 3 or 4 times now, and
Yeah,
had
over
his
10 years. Yeah,
and to me that's just ridiculous. Quade Cooper to me is was a great player for Australia. 70 Test matches. He's highly respected throughout the rugby world, and he's a very decent human being. And how he is not regarded as an Australian citizen is beyond belief, as far as I'm concerned.
absolutely. So the second last question, I think it's a very important one that says a lot about you as a person. So you are an ambassador for legacy. So what does legacy actually do, and what does it mean to you to be, you're a legate as a child, from what I understand, and be involved with legacy, and had the great Weary Dunlop, who was the former Wallaby and also war. Is he someone who was a motivating factor or an inspiration to you to being involved with legacy?
Well, I lost my father. We were a family of 4 kids, 2 girls and 2 boys. I was the second eldest, an older brother, and we lost my father in a workplace accident at the theatre, at the cinema, when I was 10 years old, and that was a big shock. But my father had served in World War II in the Australian Army, and that meant that we were eligible for support and assistance from Legacy, and that's how it all started. So Legacy was, they appoint a legatee, a senior person, to liaise with your family and make sure that the kids are all okay. And it was tough times for our family growing up in the western suburbs, but Legacy would supply money for a cricket bat or football boots or school uniforms if we needed it. There was always a helping hand there. And it was a debt that I could never pay back, to be honest. So I became an ambassador for Legacy, and I'm still involved with Legacy all these years later. And I will be eternally grateful for the support they gave to my mother and to my family. So Legacy support the dependents, the children, and the wives or spouses of people who have served in the Defence Force and have been killed or who have died as a result. And Legacy has supporting Defence Force families all over Australia, and they do an incredible job, and it's just a thrill to be involved with Legacy. You mentioned Weary Dunlop. He was more a player who represented Australia from Victoria against the odds. He was a POW in World War II and a surgeon, a very eminent surgeon. But I think the greatest thing about Weary Dunlop, apart from being a very charismatic person and an inspiration, was the work he put in post the war and post his career, putting back towards the human race and people in general. And although he was badly treated by the Japanese in World War II, a very good example of his humanitarian attitude was the fact that he billeted members of the Japanese touring rugby team in 1975 at his Toorak home. Now that says something about the caliber of the person. So yeah, he was an inspiration for all of those POWs in World War II, the Aussie POWs. He was a great leader, and he was an outstanding rugby player who did it from Victoria. So he's one of those people who all Australians should read about and be inspired.
Absolutely. I looked a little bit into, you always hear the story of Weary Dunlop when it comes up to Anzac Day, but when you actually start to look in behind it, it's just shocking there to see some of the stuff that happened and the experiences. And he's not the only person. Lots of people went through it, but what young men had to go through and witness their friends and compadres experience in war and any situation, people die, and you step up when that could well be you that's taken the next bullet, or might be the next person that gets killed, and unfortunately whatever done, your head cut off or whatever done.
he didn't hide behind anyone. If he was going to take the next bullet, so be it. That was the nature of the person.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's revered in Victoria. They have the Weary Dunlop lunch each year. It's probably been stymied by the pandemic, but they get up to 1,000 people at that Weary Dunlop lunch, and it's a great occasion.
So the final question today, and it's been an absolute delight this afternoon. I thank you very much for your time. What does the future hold for Gordon Bray?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would just say, Matt, that my career has been, as a broadcaster, has been a magic carpet ride. And I'm still on the magic carpet. I'm not commentating now, but I haven't given up hope of returning to the microphone to call international rugby. I'm certainly up for it. I love the game. And I've been asked this question. I said, it's a bit like going through a divorce with someone you still love. And I gave that answer in 1991 when the ABC lost the rugby to Channel 10. I gave exactly the same answer. Yeah. This is not new territory for me. It's happened a couple of times. But hopefully there is still a place for Gordon Bray behind a rugby microphone.
That'd be a delight to hear that. And I'll put an open offer out there to you if you're interested. I'm commentating the last round of Division 2, Hunters Hill against Newport. If we get back on the field this season, I'd love to do a call.
I can't guarantee it'll be an unbiased call if I've got to commentate Hunters Hill being the patron. But,
Hunters Hill and Newport, yeah. So
I'll have to go back to my ABC training, neutrality.
I'd love to extend the offer there if you're interested. So we'll be down there. I don't know what date it is, 14th of August or something. If fingers crossed we get back on the field.
Yeah.
Season, so.
Okay. Well, no. I'll make a commitment, providing I'm not locked away somewhere.
Yeah.
We certainly can do that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Gordon. It's been very enlightening, and your stories are fabulous. And I just really think that it can take a lot of people will take a lot out of this going forward. It's going to be broadcast to a lot of different sports people and casual rugby fans, true rugby bloods, and then general sports people as well. And I think that your contribution to sport and rugby in this country needs to be acknowledged. And yeah, you've done great work, and you're doing great work with Legacy now as well. Give back to community. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Matt, you're a true Blue supporter. The passion oozes out of your pores. I can see that. And it's been a real pleasure to have a chat with you. I mean, you put so much into the game yourself. You love the game, and you love sport, clearly, having played so many different sports. And that's the joy of being an Aussie. And there's plenty more good times to come.
Absolutely. Thanks, Gordon, and I will chat with you soon.
Okay, Matt. All the best.